Yeah, great, fantastic. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me, Jenny for being the constant contact leading up to this. It's fantastic to be here. It's my first visit to Frome, so wonderful introduction to this lovely town. And I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I was saying Frome for a long time, and I was told that was completely wrong. So yeah, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my practice today. And I suppose in a way, I'm coming in at the decolonising side of things in terms of the subject matter of this festival. A really interesting topic, and I'm intrigued by the way that environment and ecology have been linked to decolonisation in the festival. And so I'll touch on some of those themes today, and I suppose in a way this is a personal take on ideas around decolonisation. I really came through post-colonial studies, I suppose, when I was a student, first studying photography and sociology and feminism and other issues like that. But we've since segued into a decolonising space, which seems to me a very active space, and it's a very important moment at this time. Lots of institutions, particularly the arts institutions that I work in, I teach in, are thinking about decolonisation and what this means. And for me, it's something about going back into history and looking at how we got to where we are now. And that's incredibly important for me on a personal level, as well as a political and cultural one. And it seems that only by unpacking the past, we can understand where we are now. So I hope that my talk shows some examples of that thinking, and that kind of makes sense to you all. Right, so the theorist Thomas Nile has written about how we are entering a new epoch, the century of the migrant. And, you know, we hear on the news so much about people coming to this country through various means, and there's, you know, generally a kind of hostility, particularly in the right-wing media, to these kinds of journeys and these kinds of arrivals. And I wanted to think about how our attitudes towards migration and asylum seekers particularly has become so toxic and so fragmented and so aggressive. And what is it that's brought us to this point? That a kind of basic lack of humanity seems to be the tenor of the day. Not with everybody, I have to say, but we all know about these kinds of debates and how they become linked to the so-called culture wars. They're used by politicians, I think, in a particularly aggressive way. And being from a very, I suppose, diverse cultural background myself, being the child of migrants, obviously I have a personal invested interest in kind of thinking about why our attitudes exist, why certain stereotypes exist, and what is at the root, what is at the heart of this kind of inequality, this hierarchical thinking around race and place and identity, and what are the problems that it locks us into in providing a kind of divided society both within our own country and globally. So, you'll all be familiar with maps like this, the British Empire, and this one is from 1886. The British Empire is in pink. It was probably the largest empire the world has ever seen. It was dominant for hundreds of years, maybe 300 or more. I'm just reading the fantastic book Empire Land, which really indicates that the British Empire started way back in the Elizabethan era in terms of the first kinds of journeys. And we're still perhaps seeing the vestiges of this relationship to the rest of the world, this hierarchical, dominant relationship. That's what we're seeing now, I think, in contemporary society. So my family, on my father's side, were taken from India right across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific to work as indentured labourers in Fiji, which is just above New Zealand, so off the coast of Australia. And this was to support the growing sugar industry. So these kinds of trips of indenture were the product of colonial rule and resulted in Indian communities living in slave-like conditions in different parts of the world, in the West Indies, Australia, South Africa, and other places. For a long time, this history was kind of invisible. It was below the radar. We kind of knew about slavery, although for many years that was more associated with America than the UK. But I think that the lessons that we're learning from histories that are emerging now is that Britain had a very pivotal role in the Atlantic slave trade, with ships coming and going around from ports in this country out into those other parts of the world and then to America. So on some trips they'd be bringing people, on some trips they'd be bringing goods, but we were definitely part of that trade. And the indenture system was brought in towards the end of slavery, post-slavery, as a means of replacing slavery with another form of labour. But the conditions under which people worked were very similar, and they were a product of that system of slavery. Anyway, all of this meant that my father's family, 3 generations, grew up in Fiji. As a kind of post-indenture, they were allowed to stay, but they were sort of second-class citizens. And you may have heard of military coups in Fiji over the last few decades. Most of them had an anti-Indian sentiment. So the Indian community always felt that it was about to be sent back to India, or there was talk of repatriation. So even though they weren't really going to go back, they were treated in a way that they didn't belong in this space. So I grew up with these stories in my family, and my father talking about this experience and the kind of language of indenture, the gurmit or agreement. There was an idea that Indians were tricked to leave India to go and work somewhere just off India, and they ended up being taken halfway around the world. So there's a whole kind of culture around this. And so that's the sense in which I grew up with these stories. And when I became a photography student, I studied at Frome, which was West Surrey College of Art in those days. I was really interested to find out more about this history. I thought this would be a really interesting topic to explore my own background. And I was aware of family photographs, and so that led me on a search for more information about this history. And I came across some really interesting things. Looking in archives and museums and collections, both here and in Australia and the Pacific and as far away as America as well, I found that there were many images of indigenous Fijians in the collections. So Fijians were reputed to be, in the colonial period, amongst the fiercest cannibals in the world. So there was a fascination with Fijians, with their bodies, with their the kind of ways in which they dressed ceremonially. These sort of whale skin and shark skin necklaces, which you'll see if you go to places like the Pitt Rivers Museum, for example, or closer to where I live, the Box Museum in Plymouth has examples of these. So they were exotified. And we know that photography came about at the height of empire. So this medium that I loved and that I was studying, to be a photographer, was imbricated within this problematic project of shaping and making visible the bodies of the other in this situation and in this hierarchical kind of arrangement of people. And this particular image is really fascinating because it's obviously posed, it's in a studio, so portrait studios were used to create images of race that then ended up in the museum sector, which is kind of interesting in itself. And now they appear on mugs and T-shirts sold by the Fiji Museum. But this individual, it's in a missionary book. He's actually been civilized in that you can see the before and after shot where due to the efforts of the missionaries, he's almost become feminized. His skin is lighter. He's wearing a flower in his hair. He's wearing a sulu, which is, like a skirt. So it's kind of interesting that possibly within the same day or the same photo shoot, the character has been completely constructed. Anyway, these are histories of photography that have become more well known, I'd say, over the last 20, 30 years. It was quite new to be doing these kinds of explorations when I first started. And I compared it to images that I found of Indians in the same archives. And what I found was that there was a kind of invisibility. There weren't very many images of Indians in Fiji in the indentured system. And those that were quite exotified, again, in a different way, a more Orientalist kind of way. But I wondered about this invisibility, and it seemed to me that it was almost an embarrassment about the indentured system that people didn't want to know about or didn't want recorded. Because we know that in India there was massive projects of photographic recording of different castes of people. It was quite meticulous, and these photographic projects were carried out by the military and by the administration. So there was an element of coercion of people into having their photograph taken in the first place. However, now these images are a very useful historical and creative resource, and they tell us something about attitudes of the day, and that for me was really fascinating. Because I was thinking about a sort of criticality, I suppose, in my practice, and how to interpret and tell really complex stories about my own family's migrations. We subsequently ended up in Australia after different places. My parents actually met and married in this country, and then as a child we migrated to Australia. So it has been very complicated. And that's what, when people ask me where I'm from, I'm like, how long have you got, really? That question that you always get. Anyway, so over the years, I've kept coming back to these kinds of archival images, and in fairly recent years, I made this work, Materiality. I had a commission to make work at the Musée du Quai Branly, which is a kind of ethnographic museum in Paris, which is an amazing opportunity. And in their archive, they had images from both the Pacific, of the indigenous or native people in the Pacific, and people in India as well. So their collection actually is quite interesting, because obviously Britain was the colonizer in both of those places, but actually the French collection had a considerable amount of material in it by French photographers who I hadn't really heard of. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, my way of approaching this material was to blur it, actually. I tried many ways of, you get this material out of the vault, you have it for a few days, you can photograph it, and they give you a special room to work in. So I had to work very, very quickly, and so my response was to actually blur the images. I didn't want to just take them and repeat them. I didn't want to repeat that kind of violence that had been done to other people and that subjugation, and I didn't want to... So I obscured their identities, I suppose, and made them about a kind of photography rather than about that particular individual. So these were some of the images that I made in situ in the museum. And then during lockdown, I was commissioned to make a book, and I actually combined the two. In this book called Day of Shadows, and it was because I was looking at my archive of images and also walking along the River Dart, because I live in Totnes actually now. I moved from Plymouth to Totnes, and my reality was this very intense internal dialogue about these images and what was I going to do with them, and then going out for these walks, which was in the first lockdown just about the only thing you could do, and so that was kind of the state of where I was. And the idea of the book was to actually think about one day, and how you would make photographs around that. So that was my response. So as I said, I found this really nice quote by Saidiya Hartman from a book called Venus in Two Acts, which is about the figure of Venus in accounts of slavery. And she said, I want to do more than recount the violence that deposited these traces in the archive. I want to tell a story capable of retrieving what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own act of narration. So I thought, yes, actually, that really sums it up beautifully. So the flip side to that is finding paradoxically few images of indentured Indians in the archives. I knew that my own family had many photographs in their collection, and I started reaching out to people in my family from different parts of the world. So by now, Indians had migrated subsequently from Fiji, in the Fiji Indian diaspora, to Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, because of the sense that they felt unwelcome in Fiji itself. Excuse me. So you can see here, this is an alternate map of the world. And think about that empire map that I showed you earlier. And this is a map of the kind of family flight paths. That was the title of the work. And it was really a sketch of my way of thinking about my own journeys and those of my father and his brothers and sisters and how they crisscrossed the world. And India is somewhere in the middle there. At that point, I hadn't been to India, so it was the missing heart of this map, you might say. Anyway, coming back to my main point, which is that these kinds of images appeared in my family's photographic albums. So that told me that in the post-war period, Indians who had previously been quite invisible in Fiji suddenly made themselves visible. They took photography in an everyday, you might say, vernacular way within the family as a means of expressing their own sense of identity, which was constantly changing and constantly evolving. Whereas the images that I'd seen in the archive had been very fixed. That was this kind of person, stereotypical Fijian, stereotypical Indian. And suddenly there was this wonderful sense of fluidity where people were performing a sense of themselves. And this is one of my uncles here saying, "This is where I belong," and he's pointing to the beach, even though Fiji was this very much a contested space where no Indian felt 100% safe on a real beach. The threat of violence was, maybe it was blown up in their heads to be more than it really was, but it was ever present. The studio beach, the fake painted backdrop that you see on the left, that was a safe space. And so Indians took over the photographic studios in Fiji and the main towns and started producing their own images, imaging the whole community, not just the Indian community, but images of Indians obviously in these setups really fascinated me because of the sense of constructing the self and performativity and amazing hand colouring and other interventions into the photographic surface in these kind of like collages. And because I was interested myself in what you could do with photography, not just the straight image, but actually taking the image and, as Jenny was talking before, interfering with the surface, doing something more to it, taking away that naturalness of, that's a photograph, that's real, that must have happened. If we intervene in the surface, we suddenly get this interruption. It makes us very aware of the photographic process and all those little teasing issues about truth and lies and construction become more apparent and they become more intriguing, I think. But this is what some of my ancestors were doing before in a more commercial photographic sense. They were playing with the image and constructing these almost Bollywood-like dreamscapes of their reality. The boy on the beach looking at himself and possibly in the future self looking back at himself as the boy on the beach. And so in everyday photography, I found a sense of fun and a sense of play, and that was really interesting to me. Also, the way that photographs over time fade. So this is an image that's so small it can fit into the palm of your hand, and it's of two women. I'm not sure if you can make out the figures of two women. I think they're wearing saris and they're just sitting down. And this image is almost completely faded away. And so I started using bleach and toner and things like that in the darkroom to actually fade images. I was thinking about, here am I trying to retrieve memories from photographs, but actually they're also slipping away at the same time. So I'm just taking you on a whistle-stop tour of some of my early work. Yes? I've seen images from the 1930s, largely post-war, 1950s, 1960s, right up to the 70s. And then after that period, Fiji Indian families would have had their own cameras within the family. So you got more sort of less staged work, more at-home domestic photography. But it was a big occasion to go to the photographic studio and have your portrait made for Diwali, New Year, passport photographs as people started to migrate, start to come into it. So it's an incredible social history through images. And really sadly, going back after 20 or so years of making work there, I found that a lot of the photographic studios were closing down. And I'd say, what happened to all the negatives? What happened to all the pictures? And they'd say, it's gone in a skip. So that history, and I suspect this is happening globally, that analogue histories of photography are being lost. And it's almost impossible to store them, unless there's some big digitization project. But anyway, that's another of my hobby horses. We can get onto that later. Thanks. I should warn everybody, I've been swimming a lot this summer and my ears are completely blocked. So I can't hear you unless you speak very clearly. I'll try and lip read. Anyway. So the other thing that was quite interesting to me in this research was the way that people organise photographs in their homes. So we see here a kitchen wall in Vancouver. My cousin had arranged her family photographs in a very specific way. And she made this photograph so that she could remember she was going to paint the wall and she wanted to put them back in exactly the same way. So the dedication to actually curating your own photographs and in the collection is really notable and really important. So there's a lot more detailed stories I could give about this, but in the interest of time, I'll carry on. Anyway, this kind of research, looking at photographs, turning them over, eventually turned into the work called Album Pacifica, which was 100 photographs taken off the backs of photographs and then installed in an arrangement rather like the ones I'd seen in Fiji Indian diaspora homes. It's probably easier to explain if we look at the book version, which was published by Autograph, and in which I then returned the images to a sort of family album, basically. It was one that I'd constructed, but it was reminiscent of family albums that I'd seen. And people at the time asked me, well, why aren't you showing the photographs? And it was, really important to me not to, because I wanted people to imagine their own family in these images and not just see mine. And open up that space that people could imagine their own histories within this, and that this work was called Album Pacifica. And of course on the back you also get a lot of detail on the back of a photograph, particularly an old photograph that might have travelled with somebody. It's in their pocket or their suitcase, it's a bit worn, it's a bit weathered, there's a photographer's stamp, somebody might have written an inscription telling us more. So there are a lot of clues, but I think the general decay and mottling on the back of a photograph is also a bit like a map. There's something quite abstract about that I really liked. So as you can see, I was trying to get below the surface of photography at this point and kind of think about its multiple meanings across different contexts. In another work called Imaginary Edens, Photos of My Father, I tried to find every photograph of my father that I could in family albums. And in the meantime, I'd been photographing the backdrops in those studios in Fiji that I was telling you about, which were very dreamlike. Sometimes they were photographic, the more modern ones, and the older ones were hand-painted backdrops. So I removed my father from the photograph and placed these backdrops behind him. So it becomes more like about the dreamscape of a migrant. I often think when you're a migrant, your mind is in at least two spaces at once, maybe more. You may be physically in one place, but your mind is somewhere else. And so this work really alluded to that sense of being in between places and geographies and cultures and travelling over time. And obviously images of water and the sea are very important as well. I have to say, I didn't cut the original photographs. I did copy them first, just in case you're worried about that. I really couldn't bear to do that, I don't think. In this image, it was a photograph of him after he'd migrated to Australia and he'd come back to Fiji for a visit, and he was in his old bedroom. And I thought about how the migrant, when he leaves home, or he or she, is absent from that space. They leave behind a space that's the size and shape of them, and their family misses them. They're not there anymore. So this sense of departure and longing and being in exile virtually all the time that stays with you. And I saw that my father was very much kind of affected by that in his life. He migrated to Australia. He's one of the first kind of international students, Asian students, to be in Australia, and he was very much cut off from his own culture, and he adapted. He was a very humorous, intelligent person, but I think also he also felt a bit on the outside all the time, and yet Fiji, he felt he couldn't go back there either. So that was difficult. And here's my father again, actually, in a piece of work that I made, Travels in a New World too, which was, I filmed, and back in those days, it was very difficult to film. It's not like now with the digital media. I filmed my father and as many of his brothers and sisters as I could find, and he had 12 brothers and sisters, and they were now all living all around the world. So I filmed them on Super 8, and that then had to be transferred into VHS and then projected on the wall to make an installation where all of my aunties and uncles were talking at once. So it was sort of like a family gathering, but without the food. And the Pacific Ocean separates them and also unites them. So the Pacific Ocean cut in and out of this work as well. Okay. And then finally, in this sort of early period of work, I worked in studios again in Fiji, filming. This is very early digital moving image, filming people waiting for their portraits to be taken. The man on the left is obviously waiting for a passport photograph because the paradisical backdrop has been occluded by this white screen. And what really fascinated me by these portraits was the moments in between, when the studio was empty and there was some Bollywood music blaring out and there were no people in it having their portrait taken, because that seemed like a pregnant pause, just waiting for the next person. That to me was just a beautiful moment of imagination of what the photograph could be, I suppose. And then a few years later I was able to return to Fiji, and this is when I started to discover the closure of many of the studios and the sort of impossibility really of rescuing all of this material. And I felt I could really only take glimpses of it. And I gave myself much more freedom to photograph this time. The debates around documentary and constructed image had all kind of worked their way through, and I felt there was a kind of freedom in photography to be a bit more poetic, to make images of certain key moments. I was in the space that was interesting, and I just needed to work more instinctively with it. So I started making moving image and still image at the same time in the space of the studios. And this was called Cacao Street because that's the street in which my father grew up. I started off at his childhood home, which was now empty, everybody having migrated, and sort of just took loads of images and moving image, and then sort of combined the two in this work called Cacao Street. Things like my grandmother's kitchen, a curtain blowing in the breeze. And then I moved out from my father's house to the cane fields where my ancestors had actually cut cane as indentured labourers, to an old sugar refinery that was now not working, to the Rewa River, which runs through this space, and a beach, which you see here. Beautiful, idyllic beach, Pacific beach, very nice. But behind the tree lines are buried the bodies of indentured labourers who died on a ship that sank just off the coral reef here. And most of them died, and the ones that survived were rescued by the local Fijian villagers, and they came out to meet us when we went there, and they all remember this still, and they keep the graveyard behind the trees there, and they say that you can still hear the screams at night in the trees. So this is a very haunted place, and it was incredibly moving for me to hear this story. The impact of it was very powerful. And it got me thinking about shipwrecks, which when we come on to the next section will be relevant. So I just, hopefully this will work, and I'll just try and play you a little bit of this video. And it's quite long, so I might just skip through it a little bit, but just to give you a flavour of it. Put that one away. Okay. And I'm still working on this material, actually, towards a book. There's just so much material there. And the reason I paused was because the year after I managed to go to India, which is amazing because I've never been to India before, despite all of the connections. And I started putting the material from Fiji, which you see on the left, and material from India, film footage together, and actually trying to create a conversation between the two spaces. And ultimately, I think I would like to create a book which you look at, when you look at, you can't tell if you're in Fiji or India, which one you're actually thinking about. The image on the left is actually one of my relatives was telling me a story about how they used to cross the Rewa River, this river that goes through the cane fields, to visit some family members on the other side, and they used to have to flash a mirror for the boatman to come and take them across. And I thought this was a beautiful story, so I got her to reenact this in her garden with a mirror that she had, and I filmed that. So that became the kind of centerpiece of both two different video works, actually. One which was set in Fiji, the one I was going to show you, and one in which there was this conversation with India. So all these little stories, you know, I sort of just collect them over the years, these little snippets of people's lives and moments that to me are perhaps metaphors for some other longer, more epic kind of journeys. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I was then offered a job in Plymouth, at the Art College in Plymouth, and I was out in Australia at this time. And I thought, well, it would be really fascinating to kind of complete this story. You know, I've been in the Pacific and I've been in India. Obviously, I'd studied in the UK, so I'd been here before. But Plymouth in particular was a really interesting prospect because being a port city at the heart of empire, I was pretty sure that the indentured ships that my ancestors had sailed on must have gone through Plymouth at some point, along with possibly other ports in the UK. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it's a very important one. And so I was really fascinated to come over and almost treat that being there, although I was teaching, so I was really busy, but actually treat it as a kind of residency and actually think about how I could you know, kind of further my work, make these connections in my work between all of these different geographic locations. So I'm sure you all know where Plymouth is, down in the southwest, in Devon, not far from here. I was very lucky to meet Mallory Haas, who's the director of the Ships Project in Plymouth, which is an archaeology research group. And she's actually a diver, and they basically go diving in Plymouth Sound and all around Devon and Cornwall. But she's obsessed with Plymouth, looking for shipwrecks. And Plymouth Sound has over 600 shipwrecks in the Sound alone, and that doesn't count all the other ones up and down the coast. So it's a remarkable site of archaeology. And many of these ships were obviously involved in some form of trade, whether it's be people or goods, you know, in the empire, in colonialism, before that and after that. So we got talking, and it was really, really interesting to see how our work overlapped. And I wondered, I'd been looking at photographs for a kind of clue about, to tell me more about colonialism, post-colonial conditions, how my family came to be where it was. And suddenly I was looking at archaeology in the same kind of way, looking for clues. And it ended up being an exhibition called Paradise Lost, and I have a catalogue here if anybody would like to look at that after the talk. And Mark from Paragon Books is here, is the only UK distributor of the catalogue, so you can talk to Mark as well if you're interested. So what I wanted to do in this exhibition was to combine moving image and still, again, and to think about images in archives. So I looked at images from the box and other local archives of shipwrecks, and think about that moment of a ship going down, and in a sense create a space that thought about the lost lives of slaves and indentured people, and also people in the UK, working class people, sailors who went out and died in these shipwrecks. And apparently in Cornwall there are whole villages where all the menfolk went out and none came back, and just the women and children were left. So it struck me that this was about class as much as it was about race, and I think that what we see in the British Empire is a kind of cruelty towards those who were less powerful, and that seems to, in a way, the relationships that were set up within that empire are still with us in the form of global capitalism. I see that it was the kernel of this kind of relationships that we have in global capitalism, and including damage to the environment and the other issues that I'm sure we've been talking about today. So I wanted to put all of that into the work, and it was also interrupted by lockdown, so the show was delayed by at least a year because of that. And luckily, working with Mallory, I was able to find artefacts to photograph and to include in the actual exhibition, and also made this video piece with the singer Mashumi Baumak, who wrote an original song, and it's a lament for lost souls, both Indian, English, all the people who would have died in shipwrecks. So I'm trying to find a kind of common space here to just meditate for a moment on this relationship and these losses and this very sad history, in a way. I was very lucky to find the figure on the top is actually a little figure from India. So when ships went down, their cargo was obviously lost. It's at the bottom of the sea. It becomes kind of damaged, but it also reflects those international journeys. So you'll find artifacts from China and India and other places that reflect where they've actually been. So we had actual archaeological artifacts in the exhibition as well. And I'm just looking at the time. Yeah, we're getting a bit low on time. So this is just the catalogue, just showing different essays. And Mashumi. Mashumi's actually, as I said, she's a singer and composer, and she lives in India. And what she does is actually goes out to villages and records songs that would otherwise be lost. So the ideas that I had about photography being lost from different parts of the world really resonated with Mashumi, and I met her when I went to India, and then we've had a dialogue since. So we've worked together on a couple of projects, which has been amazing. So it was important to have archaeological information and to be quite accurate about it. And also, at the end of the book, I reflected on, this is an image from Cawnpore, where there was a massacre and subsequent pillaging, which led to artifacts actually being brought back to UK museums. I was just reading the other day, which is fascinating. I never knew where my family actually came from in India, not exactly. And there were rumours it was North India. And the last surviving really elderly relative was my grandmother's sister, and she must have been about 90. And I asked her, I said, where did we actually come from? And she just whispered in my ear, Kanpur. And then I thought, wow. And I told my father this, and he said, I never knew that, So it was just like a little secret that had been given to me. And then years later, a friend of mine found this image in an auction in Plymouth, an image of Cawnpore, and I thought, I wonder, and it's actually the same place, just with a different spelling. And so it was just incredible how these items and artifacts sort of just resonate and allow you to tell your story in a little bit more detail. And I think I'm going to stop there because we're just about out of time. So thank you very much for listening.